A starving girl in the brutal winter of 1345 sacrificed her only meal to a dying beast in the snow. She thought she was saving a wild animal. She didn't know she had just bought the eternal devotion of a ruthless conqueror who was about to rewrite her entire destiny. The winter of 1345 was recorded in the parish archives of Ashbourne as the year of the White Death. Snowdrifts swallowed the humble thatched cottages of the lower valley, and frost clung to the bare, skeletal branches of the ancient whispering woods. For the peasants living under the tyrannical thumb of Lord Percival Croft, starvation was not a looming threat. It was a daily, gnawing reality. Among the most desperate was Isolde Merryweather, a young woman of 19, whose life had been stripped of all warmth following the demise of her parents to the sweating sickness the year prior. Isolde's days were a brutal cycle of endless labor and agonizing hunger. Lord Croft demanded a crippling tithe of firewood and winter wheat from the serfs, leaving them to subsist on boiled tree bark and watery gruel. On the eve of St. Jude, the temperature plummeted further, snapping tree limbs with the sheer force of the cold. Isolde had spent the entire day scouring the treacherous fringes of the northern woods for fallen branches, her hands blistered and her thin, ragged cloak offering no protection against the biting wind. Tucked inside her wool pocket was a single, hardened crust of rye bread, her wage for a week of mending tapestries in the damp cellars of Lord Croft's manor. It was barely enough to sustain a child, let alone a grown woman. But it was all she had to keep her heart beating through the night. As the pale afternoon sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long, haunting shadows across the snow, a sound pierced the deathly silence of the forest. It was not the wind. It was a low, rattling whimper, followed by a guttural snarl that vibrated through the soles of Isolde's worn leather boots. Fear urged her to run back to the village, but a strange compulsion anchored her feet. Gripping her bundle of twigs tightly, she waded through the knee-deep snow toward a thicket of dead brambles. Parting the thorny vines, Isolde gasped. Lying in a crater of trampled, crimson-stained snow was a beast unlike any she had ever seen. It was a wolf, but its proportions were monstrous, easily the size of a Highland pony. Its fur was the color of midnight, absorbing the dimming light, but it was heavily matted with frozen gore. A massive bear trap, forged from an unusual gleaming pale metal, had snapped shut over the creature's hind leg. The metal was heavily etched with foreign runes that seemed to sear the beast's flesh upon contact, emitting a faint, acrid smoke. The wolf's massive chest heaved with labored, erratic breaths. As Isolde stepped closer, the creature's head snapped toward her. Its eyes were not the hollow, primal yellow of a wild predator. They were a brilliant, piercing amber, deep and intelligent, swimming with a profoundly human agony. It bared fangs the size of iron daggers, a clear warning that even at the precipice of death, it would not go gently. Isolde's stomach gave a violent, painful cramp. She knew the unforgiving laws of nature. The weak perished, so the strong could survive. She could leave the beast to die and hurry home to chew on her precious ration. But as she looked into those amber eyes, she saw a reflection of her own profound suffering. A shared, silent understanding passed between them, two forsaken souls abandoned by a cruel world. Slowly, deliberately, Isolde dropped her bundle of firewood. She fell to her knees in the snow, ignoring the icy dampness seeping through her skirts. Reaching into her pocket, she retrieved the crust of rye bread. The beast's ears pinned back flat against its skull. It watched her every movement with predatory intensity. "I know," Isolde whispered, her voice cracking from disuse and the bitter cold. "I know it hurts. I'm so sorry." She broke the hard crust into 2 uneven pieces. With trembling fingers, she tossed the larger half toward the beast's massive snout. The wolf flinched, sniffing the bread cautiously, before snapping it up in one desperate gulp. Isolde looked at the remaining piece in her hand. Her body screamed for the nourishment. But the creature let out another shuddering gasp, its eyes fluttering closed as the poison of the silver trap worked its way into its veins. Tears of helpless frustration pricking her eyes, Isolde offered the wolf the rest of her meal. It took the second piece directly from her open palm, its wet nose brushing against her frostbitten skin. There was a gentleness to the beast's touch that defied its terrifying appearance. "Let me help you," she murmured. Isolde crawled closer to the trap. The pale metal burned her fingertips like dry ice, but she gritted her teeth. She wedged a thick, sturdy oak branch into the jaws of the trap. Using every ounce of her meager body weight, she pushed down. The springs groaned in violent protest. The metal bit deep into her own palms, slicing the skin. But she did not let go. With a sickening crunch, the jaws pried apart just enough. The wolf yanked its mangled leg free, collapsing onto its side. It was free, but it was fading fast. Isolde tore the bottom hem of her wool underskirt and bound the beast's bleeding limb, tying the fabric tight to stem the flow. Exhausted and dizzy from the exertion and hunger, she slumped back into the snow. For a long moment, the beast stared at her. It pressed its massive head against her chest, inhaling her scent deeply, as if memorizing the very essence of her soul. Then, with a sudden, astonishing burst of strength, the wolf pushed itself up and vanished into the darkening blizzard, leaving no tracks behind. Isolde returned to Ashbourne, empty-handed, her stomach hollow and her hands bleeding. For her failure to bring the daily wood, Lord Croft ordered her whipped and locked in the grain shed for 2 days without water. But as she shivered in the dark, clutching her torn hands, Isolde did not regret her choice. She had bought a life that day, even if it cost her own comfort. 3 years later, the political landscape of the realm had violently shifted. The year was 1348, and the shadow of the northern conquerors had fallen over the southern territories. The northern armies were a terrifying force, rumored to be composed of lycanthropes, men who wore the skins of beasts and fought with the ferocity of demons. They were led by King Caelan Frost, a sovereign whose name was whispered only in terrified prayers. He had systematically crushed every rebellious lord from the highlands to the coast, and now his formidable gaze was fixed upon Ashbourne. For Isolde, the past 3 years had only deepened her misery. At 22, her spirit was severely bruised, though not entirely broken. Lord Croft's cruelty had only escalated as his paranoia grew. A week prior, to settle a massive gambling debt he owed to a traveling merchant guild, Croft had decreed that Isolde would be given as payment, destined to be shipped across the sea as a slave. When Isolde had fought back, striking Croft across the face with a heavy candlestick, he had thrown her into the subterranean dungeons of the manor, charging her with high treason and attempted murder. She was scheduled to be hanged in the village square at dawn. Isolde sat in the damp, rat-infested cell, staring at the scarred palms of her hands. The wounds from the silver trap had healed into jagged white lines, a permanent reminder of the one act of pure autonomy she had ever committed. She closed her eyes, waiting for the heavy footsteps of the executioner. Instead, the ground beneath the manor violently trembled, The unmistakable thunderous blare of war horns shattered the early morning silence. Panic erupted above ground. Isolde pressed her ear to the cold iron bars of her cell. She heard the chaotic shouting of Lord Croft's guards, the clatter of dropped weapons, and the rhythmic, terrifying march of thousands of armored boots. The Conqueror had arrived early. In the main courtyard, Lord Percival Croft was trembling so violently that his velvet doublet shook. He stood before the massive iron gates as they were shoved open by towering, cloaked warriors, bearing the sigil of a snarling wolf. Through the ranks rode a man who seemed to suck the very light out of the morning air. King Calen Frost dismounted his massive war-horse. He stood 6.5 feet tall, clad in blackened steel armor, and a heavy fur mantle that draped over his broad shoulders. His features were ruggedly handsome, but etched with a lethal hardness. A jagged scar slashed across his jaw, and his eyes, a brilliant, piercing amber, scanned the courtyard with predatory calculation. "My Lord King," Croft squeaked, dropping to his knees in the mud. "Ashbourne welcomes you. We have prepared gold, silk, and our finest grain for your royal tithe." Calen ignored the groveling lord. He stepped forward, his boots squelching in the mud. He didn't look at the chests of gold or the terrified villagers. His head tilted slightly, his nostrils flaring. He was catching a scent in the wind, a scent he had carried in his memory for 3 agonizing years. The scent of rain, damp pine, and rye bread. Calen's amber eyes suddenly snapped toward the heavy iron grate embedded in the stone courtyard floor. The ventilation shaft for the dungeons. "What is down there?" Calen's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that sent shivers down the spines of every person present. Croft swallowed hard, sweating profusely. "Nothing of consequence, Your Grace. Just a violent criminal, a thieving, murderous wench scheduled for the gallows today. Please allow me to show you to the banquet hall." "Open it," Calen commanded, his gaze fixed on the grate. "My king, the stench and the filth." Before Croft could finish his sentence, Calen moved with blinding, inhuman speed. He grabbed the heavy iron grate, the very metal straining under his grip, and ripped it entirely out of the stone foundation, tossing it aside as if it weighed no more than a dry twig. "Bring her up," Calen ordered his commander. Minutes later, Isolde was dragged out of the dark, blinking violently against the harsh sunlight. She was covered in dirt, her dress torn to rags, her wrists bound in heavy iron manacles. She fell to her knees in the mud, gasping for breath, expecting the executioner's axe to fall. Lord Croft sneered, stepping forward to assert his authority. "As you can see, Your Grace, just a filthy criminal. Guards, take her to the block, so we may proceed with the king's welcome." 2 of Croft's guards reached for Isolde, but a low, terrifying growl erupted from Calen's chest. The sound was so primal, so profoundly inhuman, that the guards immediately backed away in terror. Calen stepped over the mud, his eyes locked onto Isolde. He dropped to one knee before her, heedless of the dirt staining his royal armor. He reached out with a massive, gauntleted hand and gently grasped her chin, tilting her face up to meet his. Isolde gasped. She stared into those deep, amber eyes. The breath hitched in her throat. She knew those eyes. She had seen them staring at her through a blizzard, swimming in pain. Calen's gaze dropped to her bound hands. He saw the jagged white scars crisscrossing her palms. A flicker of raw, unrestrained emotion broke through his icy facade. "You?" Calen breathed, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a monumental revelation. "It is you." Croft completely misreading the situation, laughed nervously. "Do not let her appearance fool you, my king. She is a liar and a wretch. She struck me unprovoked." Kaelan stood up slowly. The air in the courtyard seemed to freeze. He turned to Lord Croft, his amber eyes now burning with a murderous, unholy fire. "She struck you?" Kaelan repeated softly. "Yes, sire, a vicious, ungrateful creature. I assure you, her execution will be swift." "You are right," Kaelan said, drawing a massive, broad-bladed sword from his scabbard. The metal hummed ominously in the morning air. "The execution will be very swift," and in a single, devastatingly fast motion, the King of the Northern Reaches swung his blade. The heavy thud of Lord Croft's severed head hitting the frozen mud echoed like a thunderclap across the courtyard. A collective, terrified gasp rippled through the gathered villagers of Ashbourne. No scarlet spray was permitted to touch Isolde. King Kaelan had angled his strike with such unnatural precision that the tyrant's life fluid spilled entirely in the opposite direction, pooling darkly into the snow. The headless body of the cruel lord crumpled to the earth, ending years of starvation and tyranny in a single breathless fraction of a second. Silence, thick and suffocating, descended upon the manor. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Kaelan sheathed his massive sword with a sharp metallic ring that made the remaining guards flinch. He did not spare a second glance at the fallen lord. His entire focus was anchored on the shivering, filthy young woman kneeling in the mud before him. Without a word, the terrifying conqueror removed his heavy, fur-lined mantle. The fabric was spun from the thickest dire bear pelts and lined with crushed velvet. He draped it over Isolde's frail, trembling shoulders, cocooning her in a sudden, overwhelming warmth that smelled of pine needles, leather, and a faint, comforting earthiness. "Strike her irons," Kaelan commanded, his voice a low rumble that brokered no hesitation. Captain Arthur Pendleton, Kaelan's most trusted second-in-command and a veteran of the brutal Mercian campaigns, stepped forward immediately. With a heavy iron chisel and a swift strike of his warhammer, the chains binding Isolde's wrists shattered. Isolde rubbed her raw wrists, staring up at the giant of a man who had just saved her life. The amber eyes staring back at her were filled with a profound, aching tenderness that completely contradicted the ruthless execution she had just witnessed. "Why?" Isolde whispered, her voice barely audible over the stomping hooves of the Destria war horses. "I am no one, just a peasant of the lower valley." "Lower?" Kaelan knelt beside her again, uncaring of the filth staining his dark armor. He gently took her scarred hands in his immense, gauntleted grip. "You are the woman who gave her last morsel of sustenance to a dying beast," he murmured, his gaze tracing the jagged white lines on her palms where the silver trap had bitten into her flesh. "In the winter of the White Death, when the Archbishop of Canterbury himself ignored the starving masses, you showed mercy to a creature the world sought to destroy. You are far from no one, Isolde Merryweather." Isolde's breath caught in her throat. The realization washed over her like a tidal wave. The massive black wolf. The amber eyes swimming in agony. The gentle nudge of a wet nose against her frost-bitten skin. "It was you," she breathed, her eyes widening in awe and a flicker of residual fear. "You are the beast of the northern woods." "I am," Kaelan confessed, offering a slight, self-deprecating tilt of his head. 3 years ago, I was ambushed by assassins loyal to the Duke of Cornwall. They possessed weapons forged of alchemical silver, a metal highly toxic to my kind. They drove me into your woods, forcing me into a snare meant for a behemoth. The silver was burning through my veins. I was minutes away from succumbing to the poison. Then a fierce, beautiful girl with nothing to her name broke her only meal in half and ripped apart a steel jaw with her bare hands to save me. He slowly stood, effortlessly lifting Isolde into his arms, as if she weighed no more than a sparrow. She instinctively looped her arms around his thick neck, her face pressing into the crook of his shoulder. I have spent 3 years securing the northern territories and searching every village, every hamlet, every wretched dungeon for the scent of rye, bread, and rain, Calen proclaimed, his voice now booming across the courtyard for all of Ashbourne to hear. From this day forth, the lands of Ashbourne fall under the direct protection of the Northern Crown. Let no man, lord, or merchant lay a hand upon these people, for they belong to the kingdom of the wolf. He carried Isolde to his massive black warhorse, setting her gently in the saddle before mounting behind her. The warmth of his chest against her back was a steady, grounding force. As the northern army turned away from the manor, leaving the terrified remaining guards to clean up the remains of their former master, Isolde looked back at the village she had suffered in for so long. She was leaving it behind forever, riding into the unknown with a man who was both a ruthless king and a mythical beast. The journey north to the ancient fortress of Dunstanburgh took 4 days. During the ride, Calen proved to be a startlingly attentive companion. When they made camp, he personally tended to the lingering bruises Lord Croft's guards had inflicted upon her. He applied soothing salves made of Highland arnica to her skin, his massive hands incredibly gentle. Isolde learned of his curse, an ancient lycanthropic lineage passed down through the royal family of the north, tying their souls to the primal spirits of the wild. Calen was the alpha, the strongest of his line in centuries, yet he treated Isolde as if she were made of spun glass. For the first time in her life, Isolde did not feel the gnawing ache of hunger, nor the biting sting of the cold. She felt entirely, unequivocally safe. The fortress of Dunstanburgh was a marvel of architectural dominance, carved directly into the dark granite cliffs overlooking the roaring northern sea. When Isolde arrived, she was not thrown into a servant's quarters. Instead, Calen ordered her escorted to the highest tower, a suite of rooms draped in rich crimson silks and heated by a massive, roaring hearth. A fleet of handmaidens bathed her in rose water, brushed the dirt from her golden brown hair, and dressed her in a gown of midnight blue velvet embroidered with silver thread. When Isolde looked in the tall, polished glass mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. The starved, bruised serf from Ashbourne was gone. In her place stood a woman of quiet, striking resilience. However, her sudden elevation did not go unnoticed, nor was it universally welcomed. The political court of Dunstanburgh was a viper's nest of ambitious nobles. Chancellor Frederick of York, a shrewd and calculating man who controlled the kingdom's treasury, was deeply offended by Calen's obsession with a commoner. Frederick had spent years negotiating a marriage alliance between King Calen and Lady Catherine of the Hanseatic League, a union that would bring immense wealth to the northern armies. On the 3rd night of Isolde's stay, the simmering tension reached a boiling point. Calen had ridden out to the perimeter to inspect the naval blockades, leaving Isolde in her chambers. Shortly past midnight, the heavy oak door of Isolde's suite clicked open. The fire had died down to glowing embers. 3 men slipped into the room, their faces hidden behind dark leather masks. They carried woven ropes and heavy canvas sacks. Chancellor Frederick had hired mercenaries to abduct the peasant girl, intending to sell her to a slaving vessel bound for the eastern deserts. He would claim she ran away in the night, removing the obstacle to his political machinations. Isolde awoke to the sound of a boot scraping against the stone floor. Years of surviving Lord Croft's unpredictable wrath had honed her instincts. She did not scream. Instead, she rolled violently out of the massive feather bed just as a heavy net slammed onto the mattress where she had been sleeping seconds prior. "Grab the wench!" one of the mercenaries hissed, lunging across the room. Isolde snatched a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. As the first man reached for her, she swung with all her might, connecting solidly with his kneecap. The man crumpled with a muffled howl. The other two rushed her. One grabbed her hair, yanking her backward. Isolde drove her elbow into his ribs, fighting with the feral desperation of a trapped animal. She was not the same helpless girl in the snow. She had a life worth fighting for now, but they were large, heavily muscled men. The third mercenary struck her across the jaw, sending her crashing to the floor. Her vision blurred. The man leaned over her, holding a cloth soaked in a sweet-smelling, sleep-inducing chemical. Before the cloth could touch her face, the stained glass window of the bedchamber shattered inward with a deafening explosion of glass and splintered wood. A massive, terrifying shadow vaulted through the broken window. The temperature in the room plummeted. A primal, earth-shaking roar vibrated through the stone walls. Isolde looked up through her dizzy vision to see a colossal black wolf, its fur bristling with rage, its amber eyes glowing with a demonic fury. Kaelin had not ridden to the naval blockade. He had sensed the shift in the castle's atmosphere and remained close, trusting his instincts. The wolf clamped its massive jaws around the shoulder of the mercenary, holding the cloth, lifting the grown man off his feet, and throwing him across the room as easily as a rag doll. The man crashed into the stone wall and did not move. The remaining mercenary drew a dagger, his hands shaking violently. "Monster!" he screamed. The beast did not even flinch. It stalked forward, its lips pulled back to reveal teeth the size of daggers. The wolf let out a guttural snarl, a sound that promised absolute destruction. The mercenary dropped his weapon, fell to his knees, and surrendered, sobbing in terror. The wolf ignored the cowering man and rushed to Isolde's side. The monstrous beast shifted, bones cracking and reshaping in the dim light until King Kaelin knelt beside her, completely nude but wholly unbothered, his chest heaving. "Isolde!" he gasped, his human hands frantically checking her for grievous injuries. He saw the swelling on her jaw where she had been struck. His amber eyes flashed with a lethal, possessive fire. "I should have never left you unguarded." "I am fine," Isolde whispered, reaching up to cup his rugged cheek. Her scarred palm rested against his skin. "You came back for me. Again." The next morning, the great hall of Dunstanburgh was packed with every lord, lady, and knight of the realm. King Kaelin sat upon the obsidian throne, a terrifying vision of absolute authority. Before him, bound and trembling, knelt Chancellor Frederick and the surviving mercenaries. "You questioned my judgment." Kaelin's voice echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings, cold and unyielding. "You believed a woman of the earth was unfit to sit beside the King of the North. You plotted in the shadows to remove what I hold most dear." Kaelin stood up and walked down the steps. He held out his hand. Isolde stepped forward from the shadows, wearing a regal gown of crimson and gold, looking every bit a queen. Kaelin took her hand and held it up for the entire court to see. He turned her palm outward, exposing the deep, jagged white scars crisscrossing her skin. "Look closely," Kaelin commanded the silent hall. These scars were earned prying a silver trap from my flesh when the rest of the world left me to perish. This woman possesses more courage, more honor, and more royalty in her scarred hands than every noble sitting in this room combined." He turned to Isolde, dropping to one knee before his entire court. Gasps echoed through the hall. Kings did not kneel. "Isolde Merryweather," Calen spoke, his amber eyes locked onto hers, filled with eternal devotion. "You saved my life in the darkest winter. Allow me to spend all my remaining winters honoring yours. Will you be my queen, my mate, and the heart of this kingdom?" Tears blurred Isolde's vision. She looked at the man who had pulled her from the mud and shown her that power did not always equal cruelty. "Yes," she answered, her voice ringing clear and true across the hall. "Forever, yes." Chancellor Frederick was banished to the desolate penal colonies of the Iron Islands, and Calen and Isolde were wed beneath the light of a full, brilliant moon. The starving girl from the lower valley became the most beloved queen the North had ever known, ruling beside her Alpha King with a kindness and strength that echoed through them history. She had given him her last piece of bread, and in return, he gave her the world. Did this epic tale of sacrifice, loyalty, and ultimate revenge keep you on the edge of your seat? The bond between Isolde and her Alpha King proves that a single act of kindness can completely rewrite your destiny. If you loved this dramatic werewolf romance, hit that like button, share it with your friends who love fantasy stories, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, immersive tales every single week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Isolde's place?